Welcome to another edition of Signal Conversations. We're very pleased today to have Vijay Vaidheswaran, who is the U.S. business editor of The Economist. Vijay is also the chairman of the Economist Innovation Summits across Hong Kong, London, and Chicago, and an award-winning global correspondent with The Economist. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, an advisor to the World Economic Forum, and an adjunct faculty member at NYU's Stern School of Business. He's also an author of multiple books, including Need, Speed, and Greed: How the New Rules of Innovation Can Transform Business, Propel Nations to Greatness, and Tame the World's Most Wicked Problems. We invited Vijay to talk with us because this month's edition of Signal focuses on global business, and he's certainly an expert there. So welcome to the Signal Conversation, Vijay.
Great to be with you.
So let's just get started. You've written on a range of topics related to business and innovation since joining The Economist. You've had an emphasis on energy and the environment. What have you seen recently in terms of innovation in the global business environment that either surprise or energize you?
It's an extraordinary time that we're living through, of course, with the pandemic and all of its consequences. I think what we're seeing actually is an acceleration of a number of trends we had seen prior to 2020. The obvious ones are digitalization. We've seen everything from Netflix to online delivery accelerate, but we're also seeing an acceleration of the trend away from globalization that had been the prevailing pattern for 30 years towards something different. We see economic nationalism, whether it's Brexit in the UK and Europe or in the US with the sort of made in America, USA first approach taken in US politics. And we're seeing an acceleration of what The Economist calls Slo-balization. And that creates dilemmas for multinational businesses because it's not entirely economic nationalism where you just make everything close to the consumer. It's not nativism in that sense. You're still going to have global supply chains, but how much you reroute your plants from China, let's say, to be in Mexico or back in the US versus the cost that might be incurred in the transition, the additional cost to consumers, let's say, of bringing an electronic supply chain out of Shenzhen into Guadalajara. These are difficult trade-offs. And this crisis has reminded companies that things like supply chain management, which used to be seen as an unglamorous part of the business compared to strategy, let's say, or even marketing. Now, the operations guys are in the room along with the C-suite and the boardroom trying to figure out a new map, a new geography of business. And that's what's really going on in a lot of C-suites.
So how durable do you think this globalization trend is going to be?
I think globalization is going to be the reality for some years to come for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's not something new or something that arrived after Donald Trump got elected and started the China trade wars. It was happening for a decade before. It was not noticed much, but we now know from the trade data, we were already seeing regionalization, for example, happening, what had been a one-way globalization between China and the US. And so these are long-running trends, including a push from the marketplace. The rise of companies like Amazon and other retailers meant that we all started to expect everything all at once delivered tomorrow. And that has pushed companies to change and accelerate their supply chains to bring a lot of things closer to home so they can deliver them faster. It's changed logistics and supply chain networks from the opportunity perspective and the chance to innovate more quickly. So for those reasons, I think companies have been shifting and they're beginning to see advantage in doing so. And that means less globalization and maybe more digital trade. That would be a reverse flow. But in terms of physical products that you and I are talking about, I think we're going to enter a prolonged period of globalization, and it's here to stay.
I'm curious if you have, you mentioned that the operations people are now in the room. What other sort of specific changes might you have noticed in how multinational companies are managing this change?
I think that risk has become much more important. For a long time, cost was a driver of advantage. And again, the cheap China paradigm led companies to source ever cheaper, and the brittleness of supply chains didn't matter so much because you could always overcome it with other forms of advantage. And we had a few warning shots, right? The tsunami in Japan, there were flooding in northern Thailand. We've had Icelandic volcanoes. We've had multiple disruptions to supply chains that could have served as a warning. But by and large, multinationals didn't change their supply chain arrangements. But I think that the prolonged disruption that's caused by COVID, both initially in China when they were struck first by the pandemic, but more broadly, as we've seen shutdowns in air transit, cargo, it's reminded companies at the highest levels that there are new kinds of risks coming, in this case, from nature, right? It's a zoonotic virus. A pandemic emerged from nature. And in future, there may be other risks like this arising from climate change, which activists have been talking about for quite some time, that may affect factories, that may affect rates of flooding or other forms of natural disasters that affect your supply chain. And so I think companies are going to invest more in resilience. And as they do so, the question is, will they simply pass on higher costs to consumers who will be unhappy? That's one outcome that's possible. Is there a trade-off between efficiency and resilience? That's conventional wisdom. But there is a new strain of thinking that argues that if you innovate, you may be able to work your way through to find new forms of new business models and new ways to make things that are better and cheaper.
Yeah, you mentioned China, and I know you've had a lot of experience there. And I'm curious if we can sort of jump in, because I think a lot of people, when they think today of the topics we've been discussing, and in particular, a shift in the overall business climate around globalization, they think about the U.S.-China trade war that you referenced. I'm curious what your sort of potted history of that is over the last few years, and where you think it stands now and how it might impact the broader business climate.
I think the rise of China was eventually and inevitably going to lead to tension and conflict with the United States. The history of great powers shows that that was bound to be the case. Everyone has to hope that it won't lead to military conflict, because that would be a tragedy for everyone. But certainly economic conflict and tension was inevitable, and that's what we've seen manifested in quite a powerful way during the Trump administration. But these tensions on intellectual property, on the rising might of China, the use of the dollar overseas, and America's extraterritorial reach with things like sanctions, these are always going to create tensions between two bristling economic superpowers. And what we saw, though, was it became quite hostile quite quickly. And I think it caught a lot of multinational businesses, American businesses, by surprise. They did not expect such a quick turn of events. And what we've seen is that now the genie's out of the bottle. Broadly speaking, when you look at opinion polling, Americans are now quite anti-China in their position, whether they're on the left or the right of the political spectrum. And so I think whatever party is in power in Congress and in the White House, we're likely to have a set of policies that are, broadly speaking, more challenging to China's relationship with the US than has been for the last 30 years prior to President Trump's election. And so I think that that's the new reality. There's going to be friction, in particular when it comes to high tech, things like AI, cutting edge technology, quantum computing. I think we're going to find an awful lot of technological cyber warfare, as well as restrictions by the US on transfer of technology. That's going to be a point of particular friction, including in 5G, which is a telecoms technology of the future.
Exactly. And I think that, at least there seems to be, at least for now, something of a distinction, and you tell me if you agree with this, between the digital economy and the physical economy as it relates to at least the perception of these threats. As you mentioned, particularly with technology, Huawei is one very big example, and the most recent, and probably the one most people know about because it breaks into the sort of consumer social media spaces, ByteDance and TikTok. Do you believe that these kinds of these skirmishes, if you will, could end up happening to global supply chains in pulp and paper and in physical goods? Or do you think that really what is being negotiated here is the new world of the digital economy?
I think both things are going on, right? I think that the Chinese have been reserving judgment, waiting to see how far America will go we have not seen them retaliate yet in any significant way against American companies, for example. But we might well see that if things take an uglier turn, if we see a doubling down by the Trump administration, for example, on further sanctions that really squeeze the Chinese exports, then we may well see American multinationals who have enormous and highly successful businesses in China. According to their own self-reporting, US multinationals tell the business chambers that they belong to that they have high and rising profits in China. It's one of the top 3 investment destinations around the world for them. Far from running away from China, they're investing more in China because almost half of the additional growth in the global economy is expected to come from China going forward. In other words, it's a huge market at a time when the rest of the world is sinking and having quite a difficult time. And so that's a vulnerable target. And the Chinese have not gone. They've shown restraint thus far. If that changes, then I think we'll see a much uglier phase of this. But if you ask the broad outlines, I think technology is a special case. It's different, I think, from consumer products or even automotive generally. I think when it comes to those sensitive topics like high-end communications, artificial intelligence, we're going to see the US use national security rules to keep the Chinese from getting access to some of those. And that, I think, is still consistent. We can have a carve-out for national security and still have a broad economic relationship where we can get inexpensive goods at retailers in the US that are made in China. Most Americans don't get involved with the high-end AI. They want cheap stuff at Walmart, right? And decent quality. And I think that broad relationship has actually been symbiotic. Both economies have benefited tremendously over the last 30 years. American business has benefited hugely from this relationship with Chinese suppliers and manufacturing, and Chinese workers, of course, and the Chinese economy has benefited tremendously. And then, so I think that broadly speaking, that relationship will be hard to move. China doesn't want that to change very much. The real question is, will the powers that be in Washington want a different relationship? Or do they want to crush that and move away from that relationship to something else? Can we make everything we want in the US? It's an open question. Broadly speaking, the economic studies that I've seen say that it would be very expensive to replace Chinese-made goods with US-made goods. We may be able to bring the factories back, but we probably won't bring the jobs back because they'll probably be automated when they come to the US.
Is TikTok really about the data, which seems to be the issue that is in all the newspaper headlines, or is something larger at play here?
In my mind, US is not serious about data protection for its citizens. If we were, we would never allow the existing Silicon Valley companies to have access to the data the way that they do. If you look at other countries, take Europe with its GDPR protections, for example, they're much more advanced on concern about citizens' privacy, the role of technology companies in data. So what's really going on, I think, is political. TikTok is a symbol. And frankly, if there's a concern that if there were to be a war between the US and China, the Chinese could cut off our 5G networks if we allowed it in Huawei. You use the analogy with TikTok. If they cut off TikTok, it would actually prevent millions of teenagers from wasting their time on silly videos. It would actually improve American productivity. We should thank them. So I don't think it's a real issue. I think it's a totem for a political standoff between the US and China.
The idea of separate internets is antithetical to the sort of the original concept of what the internet was and what it could be. But it seems almost inevitable that very large nation states with different philosophies are going to run directly into this question of how they govern this new innovation force known as the internet. How do you handicap the future? Do you see one or the other having the greater hand at the moment?
I think the utopian dream of a global free internet with ubiquitous connectivity and in the commons, as it were, rather than controlled by governments, authoritarian interests, or corporate interests. That was certainly the dream of a lot of the early internet pioneers. That was already fading, right? It had become more of a balkanized network, even in the West, one dominated by corporate interests. And we were already having discussions about net neutrality and should we all have equal access to speed and so on. So it was already a faded dream. I think what we've seen in the last 5 to 10 years is that governments have put up that wall. And China is the best example in the sense that they're very sophisticated and their party the Communist Party clearly wants to have control over the internet. But we see Turkey, India, other countries as well modeling themselves, Russia, on that form of authoritarian control and censorship of the internet. So this was going to happen, I think, regardless. What's unfortunate is that even if you have censorship of news and criticism based on local norms and local political realities, at least with communication technologies, that is your smartphone, you could communicate around the world. You could, with 3G and 4G, those are global standards, the very bedrock on which communication developed. And now with 5G, which is the new standard, fundamentally being ruptured, it must be said, by the Trump administration, cracking down on Huawei and breaking the existing global standards on 5G into a splinternet. What will happen is that, and also strong arming our allies like Germany, Australia, Britain, and so on. What you're doing is, in effect, making it impossible for, let's say, the companies that want to do the telematics and auto controls for the future EVs, electric vehicles, or for the goggles that Google makes, or whoever comes up with next for virtual reality. They won't work on the same technology when they're put on in California as they will in Shenzhen, for example. So you're going to start to balkanize product markets, product development markets, and we need to have separate teams, one in China, one in California. And so you're really fundamentally pushing this division through the multinationals and making them into very different entities, because this sort of communication is so fundamental to the future.
Well, this is fascinating, Vijay, and I appreciate you spending a little time with us to discuss these issues, and I hope we can have you back at Signal. And I want to thank you so much for spending some time with us, and for offering these incredible insights. So thank you very much.
Thank you, John. It's been a great pleasure. Thank you.